Imagine that you have two thieves. One thief stole everything from this family, and his family continues to benefit for generations. And they just forget about the fact that they had stolen it and happily live on the proceeds of what they had stolen. The second thief does the same actions, but as they live on the proceeds, continually say how terrible the plight of the people they stole from is, and how their lives have been wrecked by this theft, and it's just so awful that this was done to them, but never intend to give the proceeds of the theft back. We would say both people are immoral, but the second one is more massively annoying, probably, right?
Yeah. Welcome to InFi, the future of finance. Hey everybody, welcome back to the InFi podcast. Today I'm going to be speaking with Gene Callahan, and specifically we're going to be talking about, he recently wrote a book review, and the book was We Have Never Been Woke, The Cultural Contradictions of a New Elite by Musa al-Gharbi. And I know Gene, I've known him for years. He and I have co-authored some journal articles, and we just go way back when I was getting my PhD at NYU. Gene would sit in on the Austrian colloquium that they held there. And so that's how Gene and I met. And well, I'm going to read you a little bit of his official bio here, and then I'll just explain a bit more of the context of this discussion. So Gene Callahan is the author of Economics for Real People and Oak Shot on Rome and America. And Gene's the co-editor of the books Tradition versus Rationalism, Critics of Enlightenment Rationalism, and Critics of Enlightenment Rationalism Revisited. He's got a PhD in political theory from Cardiff University, and he currently teaches at NYU. And among his other hats, Gene is a professional computer programmer. And so I have talked with him often on matters relating to AI. But as far as the discussion that you're about to listen to, I thought it was appropriate, even though it might seem out of the box for the InFi podcast, that, for example, our CEO here at Infineo, Cole Snell, he has often been a huge critic of the woke culture, both in Canada and the United States, with which he's very familiar, and how it is harmful to communication in the workplace, for example, right? So this isn't completely irrelevant stuff for a finance-based podcast. So with that introduction, and by the way, Gene also says in the review that he thinks this book he's reviewing is the most important nonfiction book of the year. And so again, it's just to underscore the importance of it. And if Gene is right, it also, as we're recording this, Trump has recently won the election. And so I think there is going to be a shift, a reaction against a lot of these things that Gene and I are going to talk about in the interview. So with all that introductory stuff out of the way, let's now jump into my discussion with Gene Callahan. Gene, welcome to the InFi podcast.
Why, thank you. I understand you've got a whole bunch of these things.
Podcasts? Yes, I do.
Yeah, like 15 or something.
Well, yes, 20% of that, but yes.
Okay.
So you are here not to talk about your own work, even though I have interviewed you in other venues about your own work. Well, I guess you're here to talk about your book review. So that's your work. The review is your work. But the book in question is We Have Never Been Woke. And is it Musa al-Gharbi? Am I saying his name right?
When I just interviewed him, and I didn't really have occasion to say his name. That's the way I would pronounce it. But in fact, I don't know if I've certainly never heard it said by him. So your guess is as good as mine, and that sounds right to me.
Okay. Well, I hope you know more about the content of his book than you do about pronunciation of his name.
Nope.
Okay. So his book, We Have Never Been Woke, the subtitle is The Cultural Contradictions of a New Elite. And that came out from Princeton University Press in 2024. And Gene, you have a review of it called The Fourth Awakening and Its Discontents. So
yes. Now the title was by Luke Sheehan, probably the editor of the University Book. It seems no editor ever accepts my titles. Must be a lousy title generator. They accept my pieces and change the title
right.
almost universally. But sure, that's a fine title.
Okay.
It's not mine.
It's good you mentioned that. For people who don't know, you should never get mad at someone for the title. Like, if they write an op-ed for a newspaper or, column, in general, authors don't pick the title of their pieces. And so don't ever get mad at somebody that, and a lot of times the title is deliberately clickbaity and provocative and sometimes says something that's false, even though the author didn't say anything false in the article. Like that's actually happened to me where, fortunately, they changed it, but I said, no, you misunderstood what I was arguing. That's not what I'm saying. So anyway,
Or maybe they understood it fine and just like the clickbait aspect.
That's possible as well.
But I think this is a fine title. It just doesn't happen to be mine.
Okay. All right. So I have a bunch of stuff from your review that I want to definitely ask you about, but maybe we'll give you a chance just to open up here. And because you conclude by saying you think this is the most important nonfiction book of the year, I believe.
Yeah. So John and I talked about this, but we're certainly not the only two people who have ever pointed this out. But we agreed that a big objection we have to a lot of the woke stuff going on is that it really doesn't do anything. And John said, well, I think it's even worse. It actually pulls energy from actually addressing problems. So an example that Musa and I talked about in my interview with him was, okay, the woke people involved in housing have banned the term homeless and now call these people unhoused. So I imagine going down to some guy in a cardboard box shivering under the highway overpass here in Columbia, South Carolina. We have a lot of people living under our highway overpass and saying, hey, I've really improved your situation. And he says to me, oh, did you get me a house? You got me $20 so I can get some food? No, I've now told everyone to stop calling you homeless and call you unhoused. You know, if the homeless people beat me up, I could hardly blame them. I'm not advocating violence against people who say unhoused, but it really is nothing. You've made yourself feel virtuous by angrily berating anyone who says homeless and making sure you use the term unhoused.
Now, can we
haven't done anything for the guy shivering in the cardboard box?
Now, so I agree wholeheartedly with you, but let's just in fairness and also again, just to maybe try to get both sides of this. What's interesting about that particular example is that George Carlin had a bit about that once. Do you remember that? Does that ring a bell?
I don't.
Okay, where he was taking the woke side, and so he was, because it's the kind of thing where it was typical for him to like analyze language and stuff. And so the way I'm paraphrasing here, but this is what his position was and why he was arguing this isn't just a matter of semantics, is he was saying a home, that's a very emotional laden term and it has all sorts of things going along with it. Whereas if you're saying that someone is houseless, they're like, how do you fix that? You give them housing. Whereas someone who's without a home, like that kind of mean, well, geez, around the holidays, I don't have family to bond with. And who am I going to, kiss under the mistletoe and And he's like, no. The issue is these people need housing. And so let's not call them homeless. Let's call them, I don't know if he said houseless, but he was definitely saying calling the homeless is not the right term for that. That he thought it was by labeling them homeless, that was giving us an excuse for inaction because, hey, these people got a lot of social issues going on, as opposed to, well, no, if what the problem is they lack housing, then we just give them housing and we can do that. That's a material thing.
It's interestingly in the interview, Musa had the exact opposite take of Carlin's. He felt that the move to unhoused was actually, I said it's pointless. He said, no, it's actually harmful because it sounds less, we've minimized their suffering. Now, we have to do a study to see what term gives people more of the right vibe for the situation. But the larger point is, if the main thing we're doing is changing terminology, then we're not actually addressing the problem.
Do you know, like getting in the mind of the woke culture warrior or whatever, what purpose do they think it serves? So I just told you what Carlin happened to say on stage, a long time ago. But what do you know, like the person who would defend that and say, no, we're calling them the unhoused or whatever, what function does that like give the person more dignity to say, no, we're just changing it to an economic situation, whereas homeless is more of a cultural critique and maybe we're going to blame them and say, well, it's their fault for not keeping up family ties? Or is that where they're coming from, the woke people who want to use that switch?
So there's the question of what they think they're doing and what they would tell others they're doing. And I think you're probably right about that. Now, a large point of Musa's book, as again, I understand it, we seem to be mostly in Concord when I interviewed him, so I don't think I'm saying anything radically off, is that a larger function of what they're doing is that this is a shibboleth. So a shibboleth is a word that insiders know how to pronounce and outsiders don't. It's actually a biblical term. There was
It was right. It was like they they said to pronounce it, and then they could figure out who the infiltrators were because those foreigners couldn't pronounce the word correctly. So those the people who mispronounce it, kill them. Yeah.
Yeah. So these things focus as elite gatekeeping. So one of the ways that you show that you're properly educated and belong in the elite is that you say unhoused instead of homeless. You spell black with a capital B instead of a lowercase b.
And you say black as opposed to Afro-American or African-American. Like during my lifetime, the term for that group of people has changed at least 4 times.
Right. And without any remarkable effect, as far as I can see, on the actual well-being of the people for whom the name keeps changing. And if you look at this as acting as a gatekeeping device, then constantly updating the name makes sense because only the people who properly belong in the elite at first will know the correct name. But after a while, other people will pick up on it, and then it doesn't work anymore as a shibboleth. An interesting example is that imbecile and moron were once technical psychiatric terms for certain IQ ranges, and they entered common speech as insults.
Right.
So people came up with a new, nicer name, and that name was retarded. And of course, then retarded entered common speech, and now people had to come up with another name, right? And now can't say retarded anymore. And certainly the way we talk can have an influence on the way we regard things. It's not that all concern with language is nonsense. It's that a hyper concern with language at the expense of actually doing things is indicative. Well, Musa talks, the group of people he's talking about, the new elite, he calls symbolic capitalists. And by this, he means their capital comes from symbolic activities, coding, creating podcasts, writing papers. And interestingly, while we're talking, he says, well, we, and meaning me and you and him, have these attitudes, and so he straightforwardly signs himself membership in this group. But symbolic capitalists are very concerned with symbols. And therefore, these symbolic moves are of high importance, and they're very concerned with maintaining their own elite status. Whereas actually doing something about the situation of the homeless might require maybe going and working in a soup kitchen and giving up a day at the office, and therefore you don't get as big a bonus. Moving from homeless to unhoused costs me nothing, right? In fact, I'm able to reinforce my elite status by dumping on anyone who I hear saying homeless.
Or at the very least, you're signaling your inclusion in that group of the people who are really with it and, up with it.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's not merely that it's not costing you anything, but it's actually helping your social status with the kind of people you care about.
Musa looked at, and the documentation in the book is crazy. There's 45 pages of notes. So this is one reason I think, back to the issue of why it's important. This idea has been out there, but here's someone who has gone and thoroughly documented many, many aspects of this with large studies and so forth. Hear a lot of talk about white privilege. That's been a big thing.
Yep.
And it's been studied. And I didn't go duplicate the study or anything, but this looks like a sound study. And the actual effect of talking about white privilege, of being educated in white privilege workshops and so forth, is not that people surrender any of their own privilege. Nassim Taleb said this one day. He said, well, if they're so worried about white privilege, why don't they step down from their position as president of a university and demand it be given to a black person? That would be a real move that would help eliminate white privilege, but they never do that, right? It never results in people actually giving up their own privilege, and it doesn't change their attitude towards minorities. Interestingly, whatever their attitude was, which may be very positive, whatever, white privilege workshops don't change it.
Wait, can I stop you for a second? I just want to make sure I understand. You're saying you're not merely just looking out right now and taking a snapshot and saying, the loudest people talking about white privilege actually don't seem like they're doing much. You're saying they actually have done before and after and looked at the people, surveyed their views, towards Hispanics and blacks and whatever before. Then they take a class on white privilege or workshop, and then they survey them afterward and they document, did this seminar actually change their views on anything? That's
It
what you're
did
talking about?
change their views on something,
Okay. So what was that?
but it didn't lead them to give up any of their own privilege or change their views about non-white minorities. What it did was make them despise lower class white people more than they did before.
Okay.
Because these people, I think what they come out with is these people have white privilege and look, they've squandered it. They're working in a McDonald's in Arkansas and they had all this white privilege and look at they're probably on meth and fentanyl.
Oh,
and
that's the okay. Because it totally accorded with my presumption that you said that was the outcome. That the stereotypical left-wing progressive professor at Harvard, white professor, male professor at Harvard, would look down his nose like the worst people to him are the rednecks in Appalachia or something. But I would have thought the reason would be that, oh, those people are so bigoted, whereas I, am not. But you're saying, no, it's actually, he looks down at their failure and says, oh, how come they're not an Ivy League professor like I am when they are just as white as I am? And so they had all the privileges in the world at birth and they just didn't use it the way I did.
Yeah, Musa's point is that it allows them to justify the poverty that you see in rural white America. Not only do they not personally need to give up any privilege, in fact, maybe these people have more than they deserve, the lower class white people,
Right.
because they had this white privilege and all they did was squander it. They just started doing drugs and making babies out of wedlock. And so who cares? So a discourse that supposedly is egalitarian and supposedly is aimed at social justice is instead resulting in people caring less about people who are very poor in many cases. Musa points out the plurality of poor people in the US are white, and this white privilege discourse gives people a excuse for not caring or, saying that they actually deserve what they got. You can find this online, you can.
Oh, yeah, this isn't the exact same thing you're just talking about, but the new talking point going around Twitter, or X, is that, oh, you know why Trump got reelected is because look at how poorly educated, all his voters are. And like now all of a sudden it's really funny to make fun of people for not being a college graduate or something. Whereas they wouldn't have talked like that if it was like disparities in educational outcomes among the races. That would be evidence that, we need to have more funding for Black and Hispanic students, not, oh, look at these, they can't even finish high school.
Right. Yeah. So it's an excuse for not caring about their poverty and their difficult situation.
So why don't we just keep going with that? What you talked in your review about this notion of the consecrated minorities.
Yes.
Is that enough of a jog for you to go off on that? Okay. Yeah. Can you speak about that?
So it turns out, this is another thing well documented in the book, that most non-white people in the US do not talk woke talk. I happen to perform in a Black gospel group. Well, Black except for the percussionist.
Who's you?
Me, out in Black churches. And you don't hear this woke discourse.
Can we stop for a second, pump the brake? I realize we just jumped right into that. What does woke mean? And because we might have some foreign listeners of this show that they don't even know what we're talking about. What does that mean?
Well, it's this complex of attitudes. It's very oriented towards the way we talk about things, the way we describe things. There's a hyper concern. There's a contest about how anti-racist and anti-transphobe and anti-homophobe you are. So there's a kind of performative race. I'm describing it the way I understand
what we mean by
how the term can be applied sensibly. It's this hyper concern with talking a talk about these subjects and sort of competitive. I'm actually more concerned than you are because not only do I denounce myself for my white privilege, I acknowledge that the land I'm on is stolen from American Indians. I reject my cis-normative heterosexual privilege. This kind of talk, it's discourse-based.
Okay. And so lately, at least in the US, it's almost just been embraced totally by the critics of it. Like to call someone woke is like an insult. But originally, right, the term where it came from is like oh, if you're awake, that means like you're aware of what's going on. And
Yeah,
so to
there
be
was,
woke was a good thing if you were using it in the non-ironic way, but now to
yeah,
make fun of those people, yeah.
my understanding is it arose in more radical Black critiques of society,
Mhm.
and that someone was woke if they got the fact that, well, the system is oriented this way and the system is not set up to allow you to succeed. And this was being woke. You've woken up to these
Yeah.
facts.
Okay. Yeah.
Uh, and then I think it evolved from there. It got adopted. But anyway, Musa makes the point that this discourse is overwhelmingly spoken by upper middle class white people, and that minorities in the US do not speak this way, are not interested in this form of talk. So, a consecrated minority is someone who has learned, and a lot of times they've gone through some elite educational institutions, and they've figured out that what these white gatekeepers want them to do is learn to speak this way, learn to talk this lingo. Ibrahim Kendi, right, is a great example, but you should be talking about white privilege and systematic white racism and heteronormativity and so forth, and that this is what gets you approved. And if you're a minority who will talk this way, then you'll get a lot of applause from the elite gatekeepers. And as long as you keep talking that way, and I gave the example of Dave Chappelle, who began veering off from the approved dialogue and immediately got denounced on X.com as he was punching down, right?
Yep.
And
Yep.
he has lost it and is no longer approved. So somebody else will be found to replace. Not that there's a one-to-one replacement, right? They're not
Right.
putting out ads. We need the new Dave Chappelle. But the elite will move on and find minorities who are saying what they like.
Right. So
And
yeah, he falls out of the pantheon of, he went from, oh yeah, this hilarious comedian and he's really good on, police brutality or something. But now, nope, since he said some of those things and, is anti-trans or, and they're
Yep.
telling of it transphobic, that now he's canceled. We don't talk about Dave Chappelle anymore.
exactly. So this is what Musa's talking about. The woke elite, to the extent they want to hear minority voices, supposedly there's a lot about empowering minority voices and listening to the disadvantaged and so forth. But they only actually want to listen to the disadvantaged to say the things they want these disadvantaged people to say.
Yeah.
And the vast bulk of non-white people in the US, they're not very interested in listening to it all. And this has been studied. This discourse is not common amongst non-whites unless they've gone to a university, and particularly an elite university. They don't talk this way. These are not their main concerns. People are more concerned about the fact 3 people got shot in their neighborhood last weekend, and there's crack dealers on the corner, and the groceries are more expensive, and are not deeply concerned about systematic white racism. This is not what they're expressing as their day-to-day concerns.
And they're certainly not like stopping someone and saying, hey, the term is unhoused.
Yeah, that's right. A great example that came up in one of my professions, software engineering. GitHub was hosting code repositories, and you could branch so people could work on different things. And the chief branch was called the master branch. And somebody said, whoa, that's slavery. We can't call it that anymore. And they had made a big deal. Okay, now it's called the main branch. And I just imagine going into a housing project and telling people, hey, your life's a lot better. You know what just happened? And seeing how happy they'd be. What? GitHub changed the name from master to main. Hooray. Right? So these concerns are not the concerns of the vast bulk of minority people. And this is, in fact, not really of interest to our elites. And you can look at the reaction to the fact that I think it wound up, Trump got like 45% of the Latino vote. Well, another You look like you might have frozen. Are you?
No, I'm out here.
Oh, great. You're just transfixed by what I was saying.
Well, I didn't know if you were waiting for me to say whether that was true or not. I was like, I don't know off the top of my head how much you got. So,
Yeah. It
yeah.
was something like 45%. A great example is Latinx, or however that's supposed to be.
Yeah. I was going to say, is it Latinx? That kind of underscores the point. I don't even know how to pronounce that because I'd never, no one just says that.
Our elites love using this term, right?
Just again, for foreign listeners. So it's because my understanding, correct me, G, is that the normal way to speak it is Latina or Latino, like to denote male or female. But hey, if we're in this new world where we don't want to assign gender through language and whatnot, or we want to leave it that either Latinx or Latinx is the way that you can sort of be gender neutral to talk about a person of Hispanic origin.
Yeah, Latino and Latina assumes a gender binary, doesn't it?
Right.
And so we can't be assuming that. But I think 3% of Latinos actually use the term, and the vast majority of them outright reject it. And there's like, what? No, Latinx, what's that? And they, by the way, they're doing it. I've seen a book with Filipinx now. So X has invaded the Philippines as well.
Nice. Okay.
And so, but the elites don't care that these people themselves don't like this term. But who cares? We're going to call you that anyway. Supposedly this is going to listen to their voices and promote the voices of the disadvantaged. But the fact they don't like the term means nothing.
Yeah, we can't get in people's minds, but presumably because they're thinking, how would they justify that to themselves if someone pointed that out, that discrepancy? They would probably say, well, how could you expect them to? They're dealing with poverty and police brutality, whatever, whereas we're the ones that are educated and can sit back and realize the insidiousness of this gender binary that's in the language they've been steeped in. So they can't transcend this, whereas we can because we're the philosopher kings.
Yeah, and so it turns out it's very hierarchical. The woke elite assume that they should be in charge of what these people call themselves. When they vote for Trump in record numbers compared to past Republican Democrat races, it's not because anything that they're thinking that caused them to vote for Trump. It's because Jared Kushner bought some Spanish language media network and he's brainwashed them. I actually saw that. So the people the elites are caring for, they don't have a lot of agency of their own. We supposedly are promoting their voices, but only if their voices back the elite narrative. So that's the idea of the anointed,
the consecrated minorities.
Consecrated minority.
And can I just circle back? You mentioned it, but just to elaborate on it. So it's not merely that they go out and find the ones that represent the views they want amplified and hold them up and, oh, look at this. But they're vicious. I don't think I've ever seen someone more racist than Keith Olbermann talking about a black conservative. Like the way white liberals on Twitter refer to like Candace Owens, for example, just saying the most outrageous stuff. And it makes you think like it's bottled up inside them and they want to call women the B word or the C word and call black people the N word, but they know they can't. But it's okay if it's someone that the other progressives hate their guts too, and then they can kind of get away with it. And so, again, I'm psychoanalyzing, but it is vicious to see, or, like people who really, America doesn't have females because America is misogynist or whatever. And those people, to see how they talked about Sarah Palin when she was John McCain's running mate, like it was just vicious.
Yes.
Now I've rendered you frozen.
Yeah, no, that made me think of something. So you would think that promoting minority voices would mean that whatever these minorities have to say should be listened to, at least. If not necessarily agreed with. Even if I don't agree with it, maybe they have some perspective on their situation. I don't. I mean, most likely they have some perspective on their situation that I don't, because after all, they're the Latinx and black people, and I'm not. But instead, what happens is if the black or Latino person doesn't exactly echo back what I want to hear, I condemn them and turn on them in a way that would be shocking if Republican did it. Would certainly be broadcast as an instance of how racist these Republicans were.
Okay, well, what's interesting, you alluded to it earlier, but I wanted to let you expand on it. So we're going along with this, that it allows them to feel good about themselves and to virtue signal to the people they want to impress. But look at how caring I am. And you gave the example in your review of the universities that will actually have signs saying the land that this campus sits on, was stolen from Native Americans, but they don't give it back to them. They just want, hey, everyone, we just want to acknowledge that we know this is stolen land. This country should be ashamed of itself, but we're going to keep our university here, and all our tenured professors are going to keep coming here and getting $200,000 a year to lecture very privileged white kids.
Yeah, Musa gives a nice lead-in to where he introduces this. It said, imagine that you have two thieves. One thief stole everything from this family, and his family continues to benefit for generations. And they just forget about the fact that they had stolen it and happily live on the proceeds of what they had stolen. The second thief does the same actions, but as they live on the proceeds, continually say how terrible the plight of the people they stole from is, and how their lives have been wrecked by this theft. And it's just so awful that this was done to them, but never intend to give the proceeds of the theft back. We would say both people are immoral, but the second one is more massively annoying, probably, right?
Yeah.
So it really is that whole issue of what do we do about past injustices is vexed one, right? It doesn't matter. You can be in libertarian anarchist theory or social communitarian theory, and how exactly you would sort this out and undo past injustices is not easy, right? I mean, who gets the land back? Someone is 1/8 American Indian and 7/8 white. Do they have to give land to 1/8 of themselves and take it from 7/8, right? How do we possibly sort through that? But if you're going to keep harping on the fact that this land was stolen, well, you really ought to be also lobbying to do something about it. For instance, Columbia University could shut down, move to some buildings in Midtown Manhattan and turn the land over to the closest group of Indians they could find who occupied that place. I mean, if the board of trustees agreed with this plan, it's totally feasible. In many cases, we do know what Indian tribe was in a particular area, and there is some surviving tribal organization, and the university, lamenting how they're existing on stolen land, could identify here, well, it was these Navajo who were here before, and here's the Navajo Nation in a reservation over in the next state. So we could go to less beautiful quarters and still educate our students in some downtown office buildings that are vacant since COVID and give this nice campus to the Navajo Nation. So if you really are upset about this, you would think you would do something like that, but it's never even suggested that I've seen.
Yeah. It's not the exact same thing, but one of my favorite lines that Ludwig von Mises put out was to say that the workers in the advanced Western societies are all about income redistribution. But then if you pointed out to them, okay, well, right now, your standard of living is several times higher than the people who live in Africa or Asia or whatever. So you're going to redistribute your income to them, right? And no. We mean within our country. We don't mean across the globe. That would be insane. So what about here? I'm going to read this part and then I'll let you respond. But I like the part about the term homophobic and how it's like they want to have their cake and eat it too. Let me just see. I'll search for the word cake because it's only once. All right. Al-Gharbi also periodically uses the slur. Oh, so here, Gene, you're actually quibbling with the author of this book. And so you're saying you love the book, but here, so just so the listeners, this interview don't get mixed up. So here, Gene is actually pointing out one of the things he doesn't care for in the book. Al-Gharbi also periodically uses the slur terms homophobe and transphobe. These are not serious elements of social analysis and do not belong in a book of this quality. We can find objections to homosexuality in the words of Buddha, Plato, St. Paul, Muhammad, Aquinas, and many other serious thinkers. It is absurd to chalk these cases up to a common phobia they all had. What's more, the people who use these terms do not actually treat their targets as having a phobia. We do not morally condemn claustrophobics, but the people who use homophobic and transphobic certainly do mean to condemn those they label. These terms are attempts to have one's cake and eat it too. We do not need to seriously consider any of the aforementioned thinkers' opinions on homosexuality. No, they were suffering from a phobia. But at the same time, we can still morally condemn them because somehow this phobia is not a mental affliction they suffer from, but a deliberate choice on their part. So that was pretty self-explanatory, but do you want to just respond or react or just say, well, yeah, that was a great paragraph I wrote there?
Well, yes, kudos to me. It's interesting. So the origin of this, as I understand it, was someone who actually wanted to posit that objections to homosexuality were a phobia in the strict psychological, psychiatric sense.
Right, like so arachnophobia is fear of spiders, like an irrational fear. You know, like you see a spider, and you can't, you shut down, you got to get away from it, even though, that doesn't really make sense. There's no reason to be that afraid of a spider.
Yeah. So if I've challenged this term online, typically the person using it will say, well, I don't mean an actual phobia, because if it was a phobia, we would be trying to help them out, right? We wouldn't morally condemning them. These are definitely used as terms of moral condemnation. So if you don't actually mean a phobia, why use this term? Well, the term serves the purpose of it shuts down the argument. So I don't know if Aquinas's case against homosexual acts fully works, and we don't want to probably divert into what it is. I could make a case that Aquinas's arguments don't work. And that's a reasonable thing to do, right? Okay, Aquinas has these objections to homosexual acts. Let's talk about them and see, do they work or don't they? And if someone says, well, I think they don't work, and here's my reasons, they're proceeding totally reasonably, right? But if you say, well, Aquinas was a homophobe, now this is some psychological derangement, and we don't need to address his arguments. Why do we need to address the arguments of someone who's mentally ill in a sense? But at the same time, we don't have to treat it, when it comes to moral condemnation, we don't treat it as though it's a mental illness. We treat it as though it's, a vicious character flaw.
Yeah, what's interesting is that same phenomenon exists. We can switch it to a less charged subject, but monetary policy, that people will refer to gold bugs. And I've even seen it, their advocacy is gold buggery. I guess actually, maybe we're not that far removed from what we were talking about a minute ago. And so, but it's a similar thing, right? That someone could come forth and, I think I even heard it applied to myself. That's why it's striking close to home. That, I can make my arguments for sound money or blah, blah, blah. And even there, I'm calling it sound money. I can make my arguments for government not inflating and having a market-produced money. And somebody will just read the art. And instead of going through point by point and trying to say, oh, yeah, Murphy with his gold buggery. And so that just lets the listener know, or the reader know, you don't need to take this seriously. The guy's nuts. And he doesn't actually even believe the arguments he's putting forward. He just knows ahead of time he wants gold to be the thing. And he just ex post comes up with some rationale. So he doesn't need, but at the same time, like you're saying, it's not just, oh, this poor guy. Imagine that, you just walk around and you have this irrational need to defend gold as money, even though that's crazy. That's, if somebody thought he was Napoleon, you wouldn't be mad at the guy. You would pity him. But yet they also are mad at me for, in their mind, deliberately trying to keep poor people poor and to, enrich my privileged rich buddies with maintenance of scarcity and the realm of monetary theory. And so it's again, this double-pronged thing that you don't need to listen to him because he's nuts, but also let's get mad at him because he chooses to be nuts, as I guess implicitly what the argument must be.
Yeah. One of the things that is important to see is the way certain questions get banned, and viewpoints can protect themselves by shutting down questioning of certain things. So if you bring up one of Aquinas's arguments on homosexuality, no need to address it. You're a homophobe. If you're talking to a Marxist and you say, well, isn't communism going to have to account for capital accumulation? Won't the workers have to not get the full value of what's produced because we need to keep the capital stock up? You'll probably get denounced as an apologist for the capitalists, right? the question itself is not allowed. So we can just condemn the person asking it. We saw this when people were talking about why does Tim Walz want to put tampons in the boys' bathrooms in Minnesota. Now, there's a question, does this bill actually require that? And I don't know if it does or not, but the discussion I saw, the people were assuming it did. And when people asked, why should we want tampons in the girls' room? They would...
A boys' room.
The boys' room, right? Sorry. Why would we want tampons in the boys' room? The response was typically something like, you hate women, don't you? You want women to bleed through their clothing. Well, no one was objecting to putting them in the girls' room. There was no objection to tampons in general, but the typical response was simply to jump on the person's character for even asking the question. And then it turned out that this didn't play out in PR, I guess, and there was a wave of responses saying the bill doesn't actually require that. Probably a lot of the people who were absolutely slandering anyone who would ask, why do we need tampons in the boys' room? When the campaign rhetoric changed, probably pivoted and said, oh, the bill doesn't require tampons in the boys' room.
Right. Yeah. I didn't see that particular one play out. I mean, I did see people jumping on those who were really, and in fairness, the critics were calling him Tampon Tim, which was not exactly a scholarly critique. But I have certainly seen that play. I've seen it like in mid-thread. I wish I could give you a specific example, but where, somebody will make a claim, people will be vociferously arguing for why, the critics will come and say, oh, that's insane. I can't believe Kamala said that. And the people will be defending what she ostensibly said. And then like 15 comments down, someone will say, this is a hoax. She didn't say that. And then everyone from that point forward will be like, I can't believe you morons fell for this.
Yeah.
It's like just defending it, 5 minutes ago. Like, and you see like some cases, the same person. It wasn't just the same team. It was literally the same guy. Once he had new information, pivoted and acted like he wasn't just defending the thing before when he thought that, in other words, he knew it was certainly plausible that Kamala or whatever would have said that. And so the conservatives weren't nuts for thinking she did and falling for the fake headline, because that's why they were defending it. They weren't just saying, no, I don't think she said that.
Just to give an example from generally you see on the other side of the fence, if you try to discuss vaccines with the most fanatical anti-vax people, you get a very similar reaction. I am not a medical doctor. I'm not an epidemiologist. And I will go into a thread like this. I'll see someone posting it and I will say, well, okay. Well, a typical maneuver is so-and-so got vaccinated and they were young and healthy. And a year later they died. And therefore the vaccine killed them.
Right.
And I'll say, okay, well, but healthy young people die. I remember, Len Bias dropping dead after being drafted by the Boston Celtics. And, this happens, right? Before these vaccines. So how do we know that this was related to the vaccine? And immediately you're told you're an apologist for Big Farm. And you're making money off Big Farm, which I wish Pfizer would give me some money. I could use some, but I am not. And
you didn't use your white privilege properly. That's your own fault, Gene.
Yeah, it is my own fault. Clearly, I would never say these pharmaceutical companies don't go wrong. I think a lot of the drugs they're peddling treat a symptom rather than the underlying cause, and maybe are okay short term, but to get people on them for life is quite probably a mistake. And there's terrible examples like thalidomide that caused all the birth defects, right? So I don't just say, oh, Big Farm did it. It must be correct. But when you actually ask for, okay, do you have a study showing this? I've actually gotten the response, how stupid to look for studies. You can just see this for yourself. Okay.
Yeah, a good one that I had on this, since you just brought it up, and this is good that we can get the anti-vaxxers to think that we're part of the cabal. But a guy posted a news article, tragic story that was like some kid in 7th grade or something at his basketball practice died of a heart attack suddenly. And this was early on, like when the vaccines had just been rolled out, and it was not common at that point for kids. You know what I mean? Like that wasn't even part of the discourse because this was very early on. And so I said to the guy, I knew him, and I said, if I clicked that, so he posted something and said, oh, gee, it's a mystery. I wonder what caused this. Everybody who knew this guy knew what he was implying.
Right.
And so I said, before I click this article, it's going to say in there that he got recently vaccinated, right? Before this practice. And I knew, and I clicked it. No, the article said nothing about it. And then his response was, well, right, because they don't want you to know what caused it. So that's why the article didn't mention that he had been. But this guy knew the kid had been, because that's clearly why he died, because he was a healthy kid. Otherwise, why would you have died of a heart attack in basketball practice? The only explanation is he must have gotten recently vaccinated, even though the article didn't say that. So anyway, it was a good example where the fact that it didn't even mention that he had been vaccinated, which is further evidence that the media was in on it and so forth. So anyway.
Yeah. It's very hard to crack through a set of beliefs that have hardened like that. And any attempt to do so, you'll probably wind up being labeled. So it's funny that you could get the same response. So, and it's interesting too, how the picture of big pharmaceutical companies pivoted sometime around 2020, whereas it was a staple of left-wing movies that big pharmaceutical companies were evil and were plotting and were, unleashing a plague in Africa so they could study it, right? And see how their vaccine did against it. They had all sorts of evil plots like this. And there was a couple decades of movies where the plot turned around, and now the pharmaceutical companies killing anyone who might reveal their perfidy, right? And suddenly you'd find the left going, well, of course the big pharmaceutical companies are acting in our interest and would protect us and wouldn't do something like this. And if you question that narrative, you could get the exact same kind of, oh, you're an anti-vax conspiracy nut.
Yeah.
Right. So in this kind of issue, both sides can protect themselves against just inquiry. I don't know if I don't have an opinion on whether the vaccines were more beneficial than harmful. Every medical treatment has risks. The fact that there's definitely some bad side effects, okay, but we expect that. On net, are they better, or are they beneficial or harmful? I don't know. But an attempt to just ask in either camp will immediately get you signed to the other camp. And of course, if you're an anti-vax nut, your question doesn't need to be answered. Just like if you're a shill for big pharma, your question doesn't need to be answered. So it's a way of shutting off questioning.
Yeah. What's good about this particular discussion, Gene, is at this point, everyone hates you and me. Because in the beginning, the first half, all the people that are concerned about the unhoused and systemic white racism and so forth, you would have angered them. And by me by platforming you, I was also guilty. But then there were a bunch of people on the right who were like, oh, yeah, these idiots. And then you start talking about vaccines, and all of a sudden, those people hate us too. So it's pretty good.
Good.
Well, what was funny, though, Gene, just to elaborate on one of the points you made there, is I saw there's a Twitter account I follow called, I think, Defiant L's or something like that. It's like making fun of leftists who flip-flop. And there was somebody who they dug it up where when Trump was still in office and announced Operation Warp Speed, she said, oh yeah, like I'm going to inject some experimental vaccine that Trump pushed into my body. No way. And then of course, once Biden was in and the vaccine was available, she was, oh, you're an idiot if you don't get the shot and do your part for public health. And yeah, you shouldn't be able to go to restaurants or something. You know what I mean? It was like it was this untested, crazy idea that when Trump was pushing it, but then once it was under Biden's admin and the politics of it's flipped, she totally flipped. So it was really, it was again, the same person. It's not just the teams changing where you could say, oh, maybe it's just what gets amplified, but no, literally the same person changing stance based on who the president was.
I'll have everybody know the only thing I injected to treat myself with COVID was bleach. So, that's it for me. There's one thing we're probably running short on time, but there's one thing I'd like to bring up that is not in the review. I think that came out in the interview that is very interesting. Musa discusses how his book itself, in a very meta way, is an example of the kind of things he's talking about. He said when he was at the University of Arizona, he could pitch to the New York Times or Washington Post, and they wouldn't even answer him. He was beneath the level of where a pitch from him needed to be answered. Then he moved to Columbia University, and now he got cold inquiries from the New York Times and the Washington Post saying, would you write something for us? And he said, I didn't get any smarter. by moving from
Mhm.
Arizona to New York City. It's the same me. My quality of writing is the same. And he said, and this book I wrote, if I wasn't affiliated with Columbia, it probably wouldn't have gotten picked up by Princeton University Press. I could have submitted the exact same words from the University of Arizona and they would have rejected it. And he said, and if I wasn't Black, at the very least, they would have made me radically alter the book to address a lot of different sensitivities. So again, he said, if I were a white professor and I submitted the exact same book, most likely it would be rejected or at the very least radically altered. So this was interesting that he says this and that he points to his book itself as an example of the kind of elite gatekeeping that
Right.
he talks about.
Mhm. Can I ask one last question in the time we have here?
Yeah.
So one thing I did, this you did come up in the review, that he says this is the fourth great awakening, and that the first one happened in the 1920s or began in the 1920s, and then there was one in the 1960s and the 80s, and now this latest wave he clocks it starting at sometime at 2011. But then you, as the reviewer, say it would have been interesting if he had tied this stuff back to where the term is coming from, the Great Awakenings, the religious revivals in the U.S. So he doesn't do that in the book, but if you feel comfortable speculating, like, can you explain like the same kind of sociological impetuses that gave rise to the Great Awakenings back when the country was more religious? Is that the same kind of stuff going on this time around, but now that it's a more secular culture, this is the way it has to express itself, or is that just not? Anyway, you get the idea.
I think I would say I'm fairly convinced that you could draw a thread connecting these. And going back even further, you've got waves of popular enthusiasm for some new movement that will resolve the earthly conundrum, as it were. Eric Voegelin at one point calls these movements Gnostic. And later he said, well, Gnosticism is really just one aspect. Maybe I didn't pick the best term as the historical studies developed. You've got a whole series of movements going back into the Middle Ages where people work out some final solution. And an early movement like this might have said, okay, Jesus lived without property and he wasn't married. And so we don't need property and we don't need marriage. And sometimes they would have complete sexual libertinism, other times complete abstinence. But there'd be this huge wave of enthusiasm and the church would react and try to stamp this out. So these are repeating phenomena for centuries of European and subsequently North American history. And I do think that it would be interesting to go and do an examination of the similarities and differences, because clearly there's differences also between these great awakenings and earlier in movements of enthusiasm, apocalypticism, right? So the Seventh-day Adventists, for instance, one of the founding beliefs was there was a certain day that the world was ending in 42, something like that. And you can look this up. It's called the Great Disappointment, I think, when a lot of Seventh-day Adventists gathered and today is the day and we're going to be taken up into heaven. And, evening came and they fell asleep and woke up the next day and world was still here. And okay, what happened to our belief system? But there are common characteristics. I think one of them is a Manichaeism. I've read that word, but Mani, a Persian prophet, was taken to have although he may not have said this, the interpretation became that the God of good and the God of evil were kind of co-powerful and were engaged in this warfare. But it was very clear who was on which side. The Puritans were the saints coming to the U.S. to establish a saintly community, and they knew who weren't the saints, the non-Puritans. This is in contrast. You see Solzhenitsyn saying, The line between good and evil runs through all our hearts.
Yep.
So the difference here is that evil is pushed outward, and it's that other group, the white supremacists or the capitalists or the Jews, right?
Mhm.
Or the opposition to the Puritans. And you have a group of saintly people, the woke or the vanguard of the proletariat, who can know what's coming and what should be done. And they know that their opposition is unredeemable. So the white supremacists, the capitalists, the Jews, whoever gets all the evil pushed onto their side, that group is not redeemable. And, the point is to defeat them.
Yep.
So we have a series of movements like this throughout Western history. And it would be interesting to take the work Musa's done and, at least trace it back into the 19th century and see what's similar and what's different with Great Awakenings.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, fascinating stuff. I think we got to wrap it up there. So, folks, my guest has been Gene Callahan. He was here talking about his review of a book that he thinks is arguably the best nonfiction book or the most important nonfiction book of the year, which was Musa al-Gharbi's We Have Never Been Woke. So, Gene, thanks so much for your time and for writing this review and coming here to talk about it.
You're welcome. All right, take care.
And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We'll see you next time.